What if the greatest threat to humanity wasn't an alien invasion, or a zombie virus, or an ancient curse? What if the thing destined to replace humanity had been living inside us all along? That's the terrifying idea at the heart of Parasite Eve. When most horror games talk about monsters, they imagine something invading the human body: a parasite, a virus, a demon, something foreign. But Parasite Eve flips that idea completely. Its horror doesn't come from something entering us. It comes from something already inside us, deciding it no longer needs us. The game transforms one of biology's most ordinary concepts, evolution, into one of gaming's most unsettling forms of horror. Because evolution has no morality, no compassion, no loyalty. It simply changes whatever survives. I am Existential Thinker, and today we're exploring how Parasite Eve turns evolution into existential horror, why its monsters are so uniquely disturbing, and why the game's greatest fear isn't death, it's becoming obsolete. One of the reasons Parasite Eve feels so unique is that its horror begins with something completely ordinary: mitochondria. If you remember basic biology, mitochondria are often called the powerhouse of the cell. They generate the energy our bodies need to function. Every moment of our lives depend on them. Most people never think about mitochondria beyond that. But there's one fascinating scientific detail that inspired Parasite Eve. Mitochondria have their own DNA. Unlike most parts of the cell, they aren't entirely genetically identical to us. Scientists believe they originated from ancient bacteria that formed a symbiotic relationship with primitive cells billions of years ago. They became part of us, but they were once something else. Parasite Eve takes that real scientific fact and asks an unsettling question. What if mitochondria were never truly under human control? What if they had simply been waiting for the right moment to reclaim their independence? Suddenly, the enemy isn't an outside force. It's something that has been living inside every human being since the beginning. That completely changes the nature of horror. You're not being invaded, you're being abandoned by your own biology. Most stories portray evolution as progress. Life becomes stronger, smarter, more advanced. Human beings often imagine themselves as the pinnacle of that process. But Parasite Eve rejects that comforting assumption. Evolution isn't trying to create humans. Evolution doesn't have goals. It doesn't have values. It doesn't care who survives. It simply rewards whatever adapts most successfully. That's an incredibly unsettling thought, because if evolution is indifferent, then humanity isn't special. We're simply another stage, and stages don't last forever. Throughout Earth's history, countless dominant species disappeared: dinosaurs, ancient marine reptiles, massive mammals. Each one seemed permanent until they weren't. Parasite Eve asks a terrifying question. Why should humans be any different? If something evolves beyond us, why would evolution preserve us? That possibility transforms biology to horror, because the game suggests that humanity isn't the destination. We're merely a temporary chapter in a much longer story. Traditional horror usually attacks the human body from the outside. A virus infects someone, a monster tears them apart, a parasite burrows into flesh. The body is the victim. But Parasite Eve takes a much more disturbing approach. The body becomes the monster. People spontaneously combust. Animals mutate into grotesque creatures. Organs transform, muscles reshape, bones distort into impossible forms. Nothing external is forcing these changes. The body is doing it to itself. That's psychologically terrifying because our bodies are supposed to be familiar. They're supposed to obey us. When you decide to move your arm, it moves. When you look into the mirror, you recognize yourself. But Parasite Eve destroys that certainty. Imagine waking up one day and realizing your own cells have different plans for your future. Your biology no longer serves you, it serves something else. The game makes players question the relationship between consciousness and the body. Who is really in control? Your mind or the microscopic organisms that keep you alive? Once that question enters your mind, it's difficult to stop thinking about it. The conflict between Aya Brea and Eve isn't simply a battle between hero and villain. It's a philosophical debate about evolution itself. Both possess extraordinary mitochondrial abilities, but they represent completely different futures. Eve believes evolution should replace humanity. From her perspective, humans have simply outlived their usefulness. A superior form of life should emerge. Human identity doesn't matter. Only biological advancement matters. Aya represents the opposite idea. She also evolves. She also changes. But she retains empathy, memory, compassion, individuality. She demonstrates that growth doesn't necessarily require abandoning humanity. And that's what makes the conflict so interesting. The game isn't asking whether evolution will happen. Evolution is inevitable. Instead, it asks a much more important question. Can humanity evolve without losing what makes us human? Or does every step forward require sacrificing part of ourselves? Another reason Parasite Eve feels so distinctive is that it replaces traditional supernatural horror with speculative science. There are no ghosts, no demons, no cursed artifacts. Instead, the game builds its horror around biology: cells, DNA, evolution, mitochondria. That choice made Parasite Eve feel remarkably modern when it was released. During the late 1990s, genetics and biotechnology were becoming major public interests. Scientific discovery inspired both hope and anxiety. People began asking questions about cloning, genetic engineering, artificial evolution, the boundaries of biology. Parasite Eve captures those fears perfectly. It suggested that humanity's greatest discoveries might also become its greatest nightmares. The unknown wasn't hiding in haunted castles anymore. It was hiding inside laboratories, inside microscopes, inside the cells of our own bodies. That grounding in real science gives the game's horror an unsettling plausibility. Because mitochondria are real, evolution is real. The game simply imagines what happens if those ordinary biological processes continue without humanity's permission. At its deepest level, Parasite Eve isn't really about death, it's about replacement. Many horror stories ask, what if humanity goes extinct? Parasite Eve asks something much worse. What if humanity survives but stops being humanity? Imagine continuing to exist physically while your identity slowly disappears. Your body changes, your instincts change, your purpose changes. Eventually, you're no longer the dominant intelligence inside yourself. That idea attacks one of our deepest fears, the fear of becoming obsolete. History is filled with technologies replacing older ones, species replacing earlier species, civilizations replacing previous civilizations. Parasite Eve applies that same principle to human evolution. It asks whether humanity itself might someday become outdated, not because of war, not because of disease, but because life simply continues evolving, and evolution has no reason to stop with us. What makes Parasite Eve such a remarkable horror game is that it doesn't fear monsters, it fears biology. It transforms evolution from a symbol of progress into a source of existential dread. The monsters aren't breaking the laws of nature, they're following them. The enemy isn't invading humanity, it's emerging from within humanity. Aya and Eve represent two different answers to the same question. What happens after humanity evolves? One path preserves compassion alongside change. The other sees humanity as nothing more than a temporary stage in life's endless transformation. And that's why Parasite Eve remains so fascinating decades later. Because beneath the monsters, beneath the action, beneath the science fiction, lies a deeply uncomfortable idea. Evolution doesn't care about our hopes. It doesn't care about our identity. It doesn't care about our survival. It only cares about what comes next. And perhaps the greatest horror of all is realizing that humanity may not be the final chapter of evolution, but only one page in a story that was never about us to begin with. Most games frame their choices from good and bad, but in Radiated Stories, the central choice makes you choose who to lose. I am Existential Thinker. Thanks for watching.